Thank you very much for having me. Wow, there's a lot of you there, isn't there? I just wanted to, I hadn't planned on saying this, but I just thought it was so wonderful when Louise said, you know, there's going to be this, don't worry, there's going to be this break, and mentioned all the reasons you might need a break, and one of them was attending to your caring responsibilities, and I just thought, I've literally never heard anyone say that. How ridiculous that that's so unusual, but how wonderful that this is something that we're talking about. So anyway, thank you very much for asking me to come and speak to you today. I've got a hell of a lot to get to because it turns out there's quite a lot of gender data gaps around. So I'm going to try to get through them. All. I really am delighted to be here, particularly in light of the announcement last week that the Scottish Government is setting up a working group on sex and gender in data, which will be led by and report to the Chief Statistician. The way Scotland has responded to invisible women has been absolutely amazing. And so I want to open with a thank you, first of all, not just for inviting me, but for being so quick to take tangible action to address these serious issues that affect women and girls around the world. It truly is overwhelming. And I'd also like to point out that although I don't sound like it, the British side of my family is actually Scottish. So, yay! I'm claiming this one as part of my heritage. Anyway, so as you can see, I'm talking to you today about creating policy for invisible women. And I want to start off by introducing you to, just fell off the stage, a good friend of mine. I can't even claim that's a male default stage because I imagine it's not. Anyway, my good friend, Reference Man. Round of applause for Reference Man, please. Or boo, boo, reference, boo. So Reference Man, his superpower is to represent everyone. Obviously, he doesn't. But Reference Man, the thing to bear in mind about him is that he's not the product of a conspiracy. He's the product of a way of thinking that goes back millennia, all the way back to another good friend of mine called Aristotle. So Aristotle believed that the female was a mutilated male body. The first departure from type is indeed that the offspring should become female instead of male. This is what he wrote in his biological treatise on the generation of animals. But he did allow that this aberration was a natural necessity. So that's nice. Thanks, Aristotle. Moving on, continues this male default Reference Man through the 16th century when there was an explosion of anatomical drawings. The female was seen as the male turned outside in. As you can see, well, I don't know if you can see, but what you've got there are female testicles and a female scrotum. The female testicles are the ovaries, the female scrotum is the uterus. They didn't get their own name until the 17th century. And the reason that they are inside the body rather than outside the body, as in normal human beings, is because the atypical, aberrant female body lacks vital heat. So basically, the male body is the ideal, and women just fail to live up to it. Le Corbusier, which my mum says I pronounce wrong, so I apologize for that. She texted me to say, you pronounce it wrong, I'm going to tell you how to pronounce it, and then never followed up. So I'm just like, thanks, Mum. That's really helpful. So I'm going to carry on saying Le Corbusier. Anyway, I don't know, whatever. He was a wanker anyway. So basically, I'm sure he was very nice. But anyway, he came up with this radical revolution in architecture, where basically the idea was the human scale, so that buildings were, instead of buildings just existing and people having to fit into them, the idea was, no, we should design buildings to fit humans, which is a great idea, and we absolutely should design buildings to fit humans. You can probably see where this is going. Because for Le Corbusier, a human was in fact a 6-foot man, British man, weirdly, even weirder, British police detective, with his arm raised, because that really is the ideal human. And, you know, I think we can all empathize with Le Corbusier there. Anyway, so this 6-foot British police detective was the human around which this was created. This is modular man, and obviously it is a man. And what is quite amazing about Le Corbusier is that rather than, as happens often when women aren't considered, it's just women are forgotten. They did actually consider creating Modular Woman, only belatedly. It started off with Modular Man, and then I guess someone said, but women exist, don't they? And they were like, okay, yeah, maybe, so we'll consider it. But then ultimately it was rejected. The female body was rejected as a source of proportional harmony. So anyway, the idea that women are too unharmonious lives on today in the form of the extremely common excuse that women are just too complicated to measure. Our travel patterns are too complicated. Our working patterns are too complicated. Our bodies are just too damn complicated. And so as a result, we carry on researching medication, building infrastructure, and planning our economies around the lives and bodies of men. Because it's simpler, and it's easier, and it's frankly cheaper. Or at least it seems cheaper. Because the truth is that by failing to measure reality, because after all, these unharmonious bodies, newsflash, do in fact represent half the world. All we are doing actually is not saving costs. We are delaying and sometimes transferring costs. And sometimes we are killing women. So, as you can see, only middle-aged men get heart attacks, which is obviously untrue, and in fact is how I ended up writing the book. It was in 2014, I was researching my first book, and I came across this thing that I'd never heard before, this thing about female heart attack symptoms. What? I had always just been taught that heart attack symptoms are heart attack symptoms. Pain in the chest and down the left arm means you're having a heart attack. It turns out, no, that is typical male heart attack symptoms. Women are much more likely to experience breathlessness, nausea, fatigue, what feels like indigestion. So first of all, women don't realize they're having a heart attack because public health information is being based around typical male heart attacks. So women don't realize, they don't go to the doctor, and they die. Then you've got women who do realize there's something wrong with them, and this was what was even more shocking to me, was women realizing that there was something wrong with them, going to the doctor, and the doctor not recognizing those symptoms. Women are in fact 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed than men in the UK. And then on top of that, you've got diagnostic tests which have been developed around the way heart attacks progress mechanically in men. So, one of the main tests is looking for blockages, and actually women may not present with blockages. So even if you do present with chest pain, there are women who are sent home from the hospital with undiagnosed chest pain. Of course, they can then go on to die. And as a result, women are in fact more likely to die following a heart attack than men. Yet again, we see this heritage of seeing the female body as aberrant in the way we talk about female heart attack symptoms as atypical. Well, actually, they're not atypical for women. They're very bloody typical. If a woman is having male heart attack symptoms, that's atypical. But that's not the way we talk about it, and this is how this ends up happening. And it's far from the only part of medicine where this is a problem. In fact, the vast majority of our medical knowledge is based on the male body. The vast majority of drugs have been researched only in the male body. The vast majority of diseases, we know much more about how they progress in the male body, even though, and we still continue to do this, even though we now know that there are sex differences in every tissue, organ, progression of every major disease. There are sex differences in all of these, and yet we aren't researching them. Why aren't we researching them? Because women are too complicated. This is the main excuse that gets given again and again and again, that basically because women have a menstrual cycle. And this is given straight face as a proper excuse by actual intelligent people. Oh, well, the menstrual cycle will interfere with the results, so we can't study that. What? Yes, of course the menstrual cycle will interfere with the results, and that's why you should study it. Are you absolutely, what is wrong with you? This is conversations that I have on Twitter that I'm acting out for you here. Because, yes, the menstrual cycle does interfere. And you kind of want to know how it's going to interfere before you release drugs out into the world. To just give one example, there are heart arrhythmia drugs that are more likely to actually trigger a heart attack in the first half of a woman's menstrual cycle. Seems like something you might want to know before you give a woman that drug. But no, better to just pretend that menstrual cycles don't exist so we can have a nice clean test. So that's one way women are too complicated. Here's another way women are too complicated. So it's our unpaid care work, just too complicated. Globally, women do 3 times the amount of unpaid care work that men do. According to the IMF, this can be further subdivided into twice as much childcare and 4 times as much housework. Isn't that interesting? Men have started doing a little bit of work, but they just would rather not clean the toilet. I can't think why. This is not a man-hating speech. Actually, are there any men here? Anyway, so all this unpaid work does have an economic value. McKinsey, for example, estimates that women's unpaid care work contributes $10 trillion to annual global GDP. An Australian study found that unpaid childcare should be regarded as Australia's largest industry, generating $345 billion, or almost 3 times the financial and insurance services industry, which is the largest industry in the formal economy. The problem is we only have estimates, because no country is systematically counting women's unpaid care work, because women's unpaid care work has never been formally included in GDP. And the reason for that is because back in the 20th century, the men, and it would have been men at the time, who were coming up, well, not it would have been, it was men at the time. I know this, I can't remember their names, but I know them by name. I think they're dead now, there's no point in me going after them. Anyway, they were coming up with a method to accurately measure our economies. And they decided, surprise, surprise, that this work that was mainly done by women was too complicated to measure. But there is a major cost to failing to capture this data, and it's one that is paid by women. So because we literally don't value women's work, it's viewed as what Sue Himmelwhite, who is a brilliant feminist economist, calls a costless resource to exploit. We just don't see the economic value, and so we think, well, we don't need to support it. And so when countries try to rein in their spending, it is usually women who end up paying the price. And that is, in fact, exactly what Westminster has been doing since 2010. A few examples. Between 2011 and 2014, children's centre budgets were cut by £82 million. Between 2010 and 2014, 285 children's centres either merged or closed. And between 2010 and 2015, local authority social care budgets fell by £5 billion. And these seemed like cuts, but they aren't cuts, because all the work of looking after children, of looking after older people, sick people, that work still needs to be done. So what these cuts represent is not a cost saving, it's a transfer of costs from the public sector onto women. And in fact, the House of Commons Library assessed that 86% of cuts since 2010 have fallen on women. The Women's Budget Group found that tax and benefit changes since 2010 will have hit women's incomes twice as hard as men's by 2020, with single mothers and Asian women being the most affected. And to add insult to injury, the latest changes are benefiting already rich men. According to the Women's Budget Group again, who, if you don't know their work, I strongly recommend you go and look them up because they are amazing and they are doing the goddesses' work. In fact, they're doing the work that the Westminster government should itself be doing because they are gender analysing all the budgets, which arguably is something that is a legal requirement under the public sector equality duty. And if anyone wants to take the UK government to court over that, please let me know. Anyway. So men in the richest 50% of households actually gained from tax and benefit changes since July 2015. So it wasn't just that women are losing, men are actually gaining. Now, the question you have to ask is, does Westminster do this because it hates women? Or, I'm open to this, or is it doing it because it isn't looking at the data? And I like to think it's because they're not looking at the data, because otherwise it would be too depressing. But it's really very stupid of them not to look at the data, not only because it harms women, but also it doesn't make economic sense. So, for example, this is from the Women's Budget Group, again. They found that investing 2% of GDP in the UK into social care infrastructure, so childcare and adult social care, would generate up to 1.5 million jobs. This compares to 750,000 jobs for an equivalent investment in construction, which is the usual thing that we like to invest in as a way of creating jobs. 1.5 million jobs versus 750,000. That just seems to be an open and shut case to me. It would create almost as many jobs for men as investing in construction, but up to 4 times as many jobs for women. And the good thing about that is that when you reduce women's unpaid care work, it enables more women to engage with paid work, which means more tax revenue, which means the investment pretty much paying for itself. It just makes so much sense. Why aren't we doing it? It's a very important question. Anyway, occupational health. This is another area the gender data gap crops up. Because, again, the vast majority of occupational health research has been done on men working in male-dominated occupations. And I specify on men because even when women were working in those occupations historically, they were excluded from studies as confounding factors. Women, am I right? So the result is that we know everything about safe lifting in construction, but women working as carers and cleaners can lift more in a shift than a construction worker or a miner. And we haven't even done biomechanics research on the effects of breast size on lifting techniques associated with back pain. Seems like a pretty basic thing to have done, but we haven't done that. And this is despite a female engineer alerting scientists to male bias in biomechanical studies back in the 1990s. So we've known about this for a long time, we just haven't done anything about it. We know everything about dust disease in miners. But we know barely anything when it comes to, for example, women working in nail salons. Now, you might not think of nail salons as a particularly dangerous occupation, but actually, these women who tend to be migrant women, they tend to be women with few rights, are exposed to a cocktail of chemicals in the removers and the polishers and the shellacs, many of which have been linked to cancer, to miscarriage, to lung disease. Some may alter the body's normal hormonal functions, and then, of course, there's all the dust from the acrylic nails. But there's barely any regulation on this industry, and we don't really know what impact any of this is having on the women, because all the information we have is on men, and women are not men. Women tend to be smaller than men. We have thinner skin. Both of these things will lower the level of toxins that women can be safely exposed to. So using the male default reference man toxicity level just isn't going to work. Women also tend to have higher body fat, which means that chemicals can accumulate. Sex differences in the immune systems and hormones can also affect how chemicals are absorbed. And to make matters even worse, and this is where you get sort of hidden male bias, is that the way chemicals tend to be tested is in isolation, which doesn't reflect how women tend to experience them. So this is women in the nail salon, but also women, as cleaners, women doing their second shift at home. And the effects of many of these chemicals mixing together are largely unknown, although research does suggest that exposure to a mixture of chemicals can be much more toxic than exposure to chemicals on an individual basis. And, clearly, perhaps unsurprisingly now, in Canada, they have started looking at this, basically because there were all these women who were going to this women's health centre who all had symptoms that corresponded with chemical exposure, and it turned out they were all nail salon workers. And so that's how they found out about it. So, first lesson, collect sex disaggregated data. But it's not just about collecting the data. It's also about how you analyze it. Because if you collect or analyze it carelessly, or without an understanding of gender, you may end up not sex disaggregating by proxy. So this on the left here is how transport planners have traditionally collected data. They've not aggregated travel for care work into one block. They have instead split it down within lots of different separate categories like shopping, escorting, visits, etc. And as you can see, it makes it look like employment is by far the biggest reason anyone is traveling. So if you look at the table on the left, it absolutely makes sense to design transport infrastructure around travel for employment. But the table on the right clearly tells us something different. And this table is created by a woman, a female transport planner called Inés Sánchez de Madriaga, who collected care-related travel data in Madrid. And she found that the number of trips made for caring purposes almost equaled those made for employment purposes. And she found that care was the single and foremost purpose of travel for women in much the same way as employment is the main purpose of men's travel. So suddenly it doesn't seem so clear that we should only design for employment. But on top of that, there's also, similarly to why we should be collecting data on women's unpaid care work for the economy, if you design transport infrastructure to facilitate women's unpaid care work, it enables women to engage in paid work. And again, that is good for the exchequer. So I just want to ask Louise, what time do you want me to shut up? 5 minutes? Fucking hell. Okay, can I have 10 minutes? Okay, I won't tell you about labour force surveys. Okay, let's be quick. So let's talk about solutions. Woo! So the most popular solution when it comes to male bias design is to fix the women. This is what I call the Henry Higgins effect. Why can't a woman be more like a man? And you find it all over the place, from voice recognition software suppliers who say, so this guy says that his tech only recognizes male voices and suggested that women go undergo hours of lengthy training in order to fix the many issues with women's voices. Which obviously sounds ridiculous, but this tendency crops up all over the place. For example, so much of the workplace advice to women is for women to emulate men. Be more confident. Ask for that promotion. Ask for that raise. Now, first of all, there's plenty of evidence that women are doing that. They're just not being given the raises or the promotions. But secondly, why do we assume that men are at the right level? Why are women being like men? In fact, recent research has emerged showing that while women tend to assess their intelligence accurately, men of average intelligence think they are more intelligent than 2/3 of people. So maybe, instead of asking why women can't be more like men, we should be telling men to be more like women. Anyway, but there are some solutions, which we don't have much time to go through. I'm going to be really, really quick. Okay, so 3 stone stoves. This is how most people around the world cook still. And they are incredibly toxic. They are the single largest environmental risk factor for female mortality. Women who cook on these stoves are exposed to the equivalent of more than 100 cigarettes a day. It's the #1 killer of children under the age of 5. And women development agencies have been trying for decades to create clean stoves that women can cook on to address these issues. But they haven't been able to design a stove that actually works, that women will actually use. Why? Because no one bothered speaking to women. So what have they done? They've created stoves that take much, much longer to cook on. These are women who are already cooking for up to 7 hours a day. They don't have extra time. They are stoves that don't allow you to multitask. Again, if you're cooking for 7 hours a day, you kind of need to be able to do other stuff. They are cookers that require all sorts of maintenance, which in a lot of these societies is the job of the men. And the men are like, well, why should I maintain this stove when she can just cook on the other one? So they don't get used. They require wood to be chopped up to a specific size. Again, men need to do that, the women can't do it, and so it doesn't get done. And yet, what happens in report after report after report is you find all these recommendations being, well, we need to fix the women. We need to educate the women on how important these cook stoves are. Until finally, someone decided to go at it the other way around and spoke to women and said, what do you need? And they developed this incredibly simple, very cheap solution, which I can't tell you about, but buy the book. Next slide. Right. It is really good, though. Sport. I'm going to tell you about parks in Vienna. So basically, they realized that after the age of 10, girls weren't going to the park as much as boys, and they couldn't figure out why this was. It turned out that it's because girls didn't want to compete with the boys for space. So if you have large open spaces, the girls just won't go there. So they subdivided it up. Suddenly, the girls came back. Why does this matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. One, there is very strong evidence that exercise is hugely important for girls' mental health. But actually, and this was surprising to me, it could again massively save money. And the way it would do that is by preventing fractures in later life from osteoporosis, because it turns out that exercise for girls, particularly before puberty, is incredibly important for developing bone density. So another cost-saving tip from me. Right. We're going really, really well now. I've got 1 minute to talk about snow plowing. So you might not think that snow clearing is a sexist issue, but if you think that there is anything in the world that feminists can't turn into a sexist issue, you've never met a feminist. So basically, we lack consistent sex disaggregated data from every country, but one thing we do know is that men and women tend to travel differently. Women are much more likely to walk and use public transport, men are more likely to drive. Women also have much more complicated travel patterns because they do a thing called trip chaining. This is to do with our unpaid care work, so dropping the kids off at school before you go to work, picking up groceries on the way home, dropping in on an elderly relative. Men tend to drive in and out of work. And the way they'd always cleared the snow was to do the major road arteries to service this in and out of work travel, and then the local roads and pavements. And so when they realized that they were doing this, they thought, well, it's probably harder to walk or push a buggy through 3 inches of snow, so we should probably do the pavements and local roads first, and then the major roads. And when they did this, they found suddenly that their healthcare bill fell substantially. Because it turns out that, yes, it is much harder to walk or push a buggy through 3 inches of snow, and actually women were falling over and hurting themselves and fracturing their pelvises and their legs. And so when they changed it around, so pedestrians were being injured 3 times more often than motorists in slippery or icy conditions. So obviously that changed, and it turned out the cost of all these women presenting at A&E with fractures was 3 times the cost of the winter road maintenance. Conclusion. See? I can do things. I better get a fucking standing ovation for this, let me tell you. Right, so just very, very quickly. This is a picture that someone sent me on Twitter recently, which I'm receiving lots of pictures like this recently, because I have become head of feminism's toilet division. We've got women working all over the place. Wherever there's a toilet, there is a woman taking a picture. Anyway, so that is just to illustrate the first point. Equality doesn't necessarily mean treating everyone the same. If people have different needs, you need to address those different needs. Equality means everyone having the same level of opportunity. So that's number one. Secondly, collect sex disaggregated data. And regulate for it, because all the evidence around the world shows that if you do not regulate for it, it does not happen. So governments need to step up on this one. And finally, diversity is not just a tick box. It actually makes a tangible difference to the policies, to the products, to the services that are created. For example, studies from across the OECD have found that the sex of legislators makes a difference to the legislation that is passed. Women are more likely to support women's rights issues legislation. They are more likely to spend on education. They are more likely to spend on social care. When you have women involved in negotiating peace agreements, those peace agreements are more likely to last. Analysis of medical research shows that having women involved in the team means you're much more likely to collect sex disaggregated data, and you're much more likely to gender analyze it. Whew. So that's my 3-point plan for saving the world. Thank you very much for listening. Obviously, not done yet. Anyway, I tried to fit in as much as I could. There is so much more that I wanted to say, but Louise is a big meanie, so. So thank you very much.